ICFRC hosts community programs to address topics of international interest. We thank our members, volunteers, and interns for making these forums possible since 1983, when Return of the Jedi was the #1 movie. I want to acknowledge our university and community supporters, the University of Iowa's international programs, the University of Iowa's honors program, the University of Iowa Center for Public Policy, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization. And we thank today's special sponsors, Mike Margolin, University of Iowa Community Credit Union, and Jim and Pat Fgrave. We also thank City Channel 4 for professionally recording our programs for cablecast on City Channel 4 or 118-2. And we thank the UI Library's digital archives. Over 200 ICFRC podcasts can now be found on iTunes. It is now my pleasure to introduce Christopher Merrill, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dave. It's a special pleasure to welcome Alisa Ganieva not only back to Iowa City, but to this terrific forum. Alisa came to prominence in Russia in a curious way. She comes from Dagestan originally. She moved to Moscow to study at the famous Maxim Gorky Literature Institute and acquired a reputation as a literary critic. Then she wrote a novel called Salaam, Dalgat, about a day in the life of a young Dagestani male, submitted it, published it under a pseudonym, a male pseudonym, and submitted it to the prestigious debut prize. Out of tens of thousands of applicants, entrants, this was the novel that won. And so all of Moscow literati were abuzz with, who's this young Dagestani male writer? The award was announced, and the ceremony was not until many weeks later, by which time all sorts of rumors were circulating about this young male writer. So when the prize was announced, you can imagine the consternation. And also, as Alisa told me once, the female journalists who perhaps came on to this writer in ways that would prove disastrous going forth. She went on to publish novels including Bride and Groom and The Mountain and the Wall. She's at work on a biography. Her work has been translated into 8 languages. And this fall, she was in the IWP in 2012. She's come back under a special arrangement with Grinnell College, where she goes over there and teaches 1 day a week, a collaboration which has proved quite fruitful for us. And I know you are in for a treat to hear Alisa Ganieva.
Hello, Chris. Thank you, Chris, and thanks to Foreign Council, and thanks to all of you for coming and dedicating your precious time for this event. I'm very grateful to be in Iowa again. It's my, I think, 5th time in this wonderful city and state, and I'm enjoying autumn and cornfields and campus. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going in the present-day Russia. And when people talk about Russia and the present-day Russian policies, they usually go to extremes. Some people extol President Putin's virtues and his efforts to polarize the unipolar world again. And others picture the country as a sheer authoritarian dictatorship with a Soviet-style censorship under this capitalistic surface. But in fact, the situation is much more complicated and deceptive. So officially, Russia is a European country with democratic institutions, freedom of speech, and no political prisoners, apparently. But in reality, it's just an optical illusion of a constitutional state. And legal logic in Russia is nowadays, unfortunately, replaced and substituted with a criminal code and personal mood of any given authority at any given time. So human rights violations are not happening according to some prescriptions or some existing censorship, but just they're happening randomly on occasion, and politically motivated cases are usually masked. They are presented as pertaining to some worst felonies you can imagine. So it's very hard to recognize political prisoners as such in Russia and support them publicly, because usually they are accused of the worst crimes in the world. So, I don't know, for example, you hear a news report about a man, his name is Ayub Tetiv, and early in this year he was arrested for the storage and transportation of drugs. And he's a head of the Memorial Civic Rights Organization in Chechnya, which is one of the Russian regions. So you think, okay, this is fair. It's an apparent crime to store drugs. But then when you look in this case deeper and dig deeper, you find out that it's very inconsistent. And so a man, a very respectable man, was riding in a car in a very tough Muslim-populated region with a bag full of marijuana on his front seat in broad daylight and on display. And moreover, he's a human rights activist in a region famous for its authoritarian leader who hates his professional work. So it's becoming more and more obvious, if you think about it, that he's in fact a political prisoner. Or, for example, there was a famous case, so-called theater case, last year. One of the most prominent theater directors in Russia, Kirill Serebrennikov, and his colleagues were charged on allegations of fraud regarding the use of state funds. They were accused of embezzling around 133 million rubles, which is $2 million. And it's a big larceny, if you think about that. But if you look deeper into it again, you'll see that the investigators were accusing Serebrennikov of taking a lot of money for staging Shakespeare's play, The Midsummer Night, and not staging it in reality. But still, there are so many witnesses. There are dozens of witnesses that have tickets at hand, and there are video records, and everything is telling that the play indeed took place in the theater, and money was properly spent. So the charges are definitely absurd. So it is believed in Russia that the whole theater case happened as the vengeance of one of the leaders of security forces in Russia. He had some misunderstanding with Serebrennikov, and he's trying to revenge him in this way. Or, for example, you hear about Yuri Dmitriev. He's a history teacher and also the head of a memorial civic rights organization in Karelia, which is a Russian region in the north. And he was accused of a horrendous crime. He was accused of pedophilia, and after a single anonymous denunciation 2 years ago, he was imprisoned for preparing pornography with his small adopted daughter. But then the case was overturned and dismissed after the very professional expertise took place. And it turned out that the nude photos of his daughter were taken as a part of medical record. She was unhealthy, so he was doing this medical journal and recording her weight and height, and it's a common thing in Russia. And he never shared those photos with anybody, and there were no other justifications of this accusation. So he was freed in March of this year, but then arrested again. And when you think about the reasons of this persecution, a very strange one and apparently concocted one, you'll find out that Yuri Dmitriev was a person who discovered several spots of mass murders of 1930s. He's investigating the Great Terror and Stalin purges of 1930s. And he's trying to let people know not only about victims of Stalin terror, but also about executioners and those who implemented Stalin's orders during those days. This is a very unwanted historical memory nowadays in Russia, because the authorities are trying to whitewash it, to hide it, and it became known in summer of this year that in 2014, President Putin issued a secret decree ordering to erase and to destroy all their archival records about the victims of Stalin purges. Gulag prisoners' archival records, so they're being destroyed during all these years since 2014. And Dmitriev and Memorial Organization are people who are trying to return this memory and to not to make it disappear. Another very strange case is a case of Natalia Sharina, who is a former director of the state-run library of the Ukrainian literature. 3 years ago, she was charged with incitement of hatred and enmity and disseminating extremist literature. She was arrested and searched, and after several hours of search, the investigators found several books written by one Ukrainian nationalist. Okay, that's not a very good thing to keep nationalistic literature. We can agree with that. But Sharina denies that the library really owned that literature, and she says that the policeman just planted those books, and some of those books do not even have librarian stamps. So it's a very strange situation. The whole trial of Natalia Sharina, so now she spent 19 months under house arrest, and then she was sentenced for the 4 years of suspended imprisonment. And the whole trial coincided with a wide anti-Ukraine campaign in Russia that has been spreading throughout state-run media and through the statements of public officials. Another example of this anti-Ukrainian campaign, and maybe one of the best-known one, is the case of Ukrainian filmmaker whose name is Oleg Sentsov. He's been imprisoned for 20 years of strict regime colony for plotting a terrorist act in annexed Crimea. And he was claimed to be the head of the terroristic organization consisting of 4 people. So it sounds frightening, really, because no normal person would sympathize with a terrorist. But upon a close inspection, the case also turns out to be politically motivated, because what terrorist act are we talking about? It's about the explosion of Lenin Monument in Simferopol, which is one of the towns in annexed Crimea, at night. No casualties intended. And also it's about the arson of a windowsill in an office of the ruling political party of Russia, also in Simferopol. So the only testament of Sentsov's guilt are the testimonies of 2 witnesses or his sidekicks. And one of these alleged sidekicks acknowledged during one of the court hearings that his testimonies were extracted under tortures and after tortures. So it was just a calumny, he said. So there were 4 people, and one of them really planned to explode, to put down Lenin's monument, but he was going to do it alone. And 3 of them were really involved in the arson. They set a windowsill to fire. It was a big detriment, of course. But Oleg Sentsov was innocent of all of these crimes. So they got just 7 years of imprisonment. One of them was pardoned. And Oleg Sentsov is jailed for 20 years for doing nothing. So the real reason of his imprisonment is, of course, his political position. He was a very big propagator of Crimea being a part of Ukraine. He was a big patriot of Ukraine. And he denied to acknowledge his guilt under tortures, and that is why it was this long sentence is also a kind of vengeance. So in May of this year, he started a long hunger strike, which lasted almost for 5 months. He got some glucose drops and some nutritious mixtures, but they make up just 1/3 of what our body usually needs a day. And so his hunger strike instigated a big wave of campaigns across Europe, a big wave of actions in support not only of Sentsov, but also of other Ukrainian political prisoners in Russia, because he was on a hunger strike not for his own sake, but for the sake and for the release of his compatriots, of his countrymen. And he listed 64 people, Ukrainian political prisoners in Russia, but in fact, they're told to be 83, I think, Ukrainian people who are now in Russian jails. So now a big campaign is going on among Russian activists who are trying to start an exchange process, but nothing is happening so far. So all these things, all these cases are happening not just because of some evil will of some authorities, but also due to newly introduced laws which appeared in Russian criminal code during last 5 or 6 years. And the writers' human rights organization called Free Word Association, to which I belong, they recently made a report listing these laws and the way they are affecting the freedom of speech and the situation with artists in Russia. So I would like just to list these laws and give you some examples. So 2012, the Russian authorities have gained expanded powers to block websites without a court order. The legal authority to block websites is derived from amendments to the 2006 federal law on information, IT technologies, and protection of information. Article 15 established a blacklist administered by the government agency. Websites added to the list are prohibited, and all internet service providers based in Russia are obliged to immediately block access to them. Though the lack of transparency impedes tracking of the number of affected websites, it's been estimated that as of July 2018, over 100,000 sites and more than 4 million pages have been blocked. 2013, a gay propaganda ban. It was introduced with the stated aim of protecting children through the prohibition of propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations. It enables censorship of materials about LGBTQ issues. This law violates Article 10, freedom of expression, and Article 14, prohibition of discrimination of the European Convention on Human Rights, to which Russia is, by the way, a party. The same year, Russia's criminal code was amended to criminalize a public action expressing clear disrespect for society and committed in order to offend the sensibilities of believers. And Offended Sensibilities is, by the way, the title of my recent novel. Parts 1 and 2 of this article do not provide any definition of these sensibilities of believers or what would be considered to be offensive to them. And the sanctions range from heavy fines to 3 years imprisonment. So between June 2013 and March of this year, the article has been applied at least 17 times, at least 15 convictions, ranging from fines to suspended jail sentences. So I'll give you one of the recent examples. A 19-year-old student from Barnaul, which is one of the Russian regions, a boy who likes reposting funny memes, and many teenagers like reposting funny memes on their social media pages. And once early in the morning, it was 6 in the morning, the special service policeman barged into his apartment, dragged him to the police station, asked him to open his computer, and searched all the several hundreds of pictures he had on his social media webpage. And they were shivering from laughter, according to his words, while they were examining those funny pictures. And so they regarded that 10 of these pictures were offending sensibilities of believers. So to give you an example, one of these pictures was about one of the characters of Game of Thrones. In Orthodox Christianity on Easter, when people meet each other, one person would say, "Christ has risen," and another one would say, "Indeed, he has." And so the picture, the meme pictured Jon Snow, one of the characters of Game of Thrones, as Christ. And there was an inscription, "Jon Snow has risen, indeed he has." So it's an example of the picture which could be a reason and foundation for your imprisonment. He is now awaiting his verdict. He's on a trial, his bank accounts are frozen. And it's just beginning of his life. So Daniel and many other victims of these trials, absurd trials, they have been arrested by a denunciation. So reporting and snitching on each other and telling on each other is now returning into fashion in Russia, unfortunately. And anonymous reports in present-day Russia are instigated and stimulated by different governmental instruments and implementations. For example, yesterday I was not very happy to find out that the plot of my book, Offended Sensibilities, is actually coming into life, because anonymous reports play a big role in the plot of this book. So I found out that in Dagestan, this is my native region where I'm from, the competition has been announced for the maximum of anonymous reports on people. So on people propagating extremism, like posting Jon Snow pictures, and they are promising iPhone for the first place and Xiaomi Chinese smartphones for the second and third place. And it's not the first example, because in August, our Minister of Internal Affairs also issued a decree saying that informers and finks would be gratified with huge amounts of money for their collaboration with police. And it's nice to help the police if it's about implementing justice. It's another thing to help the punitive machine, which is hurting and ruining innocent lives. So, same year, 2013, the Lugovoy Law, which is named after the parliamentarian who proposed it. Maybe you heard about Lugovoy because he's considered by British investigators to have been a direct performer of Alexander Litvinenko's notorious murder in London. You may know that Litvinenko was a former FSB Secret Service officer in Russia who had to flee to London after a conflict with his bosses, and who, among other things, accused Putin of killing a journalist, Anna Politkovskaya. And in 2006, he was famously poisoned with a highly heavy radioactive metal called polonium. And so Lugovoy was the one who was considered to murder him. So Lugovoy Law mandates the Russian authorities to block online sources that disseminate calls for mass riots, extremist activities, or participation in unsanctioned mass public events. So you just can't go on a street and participate in a rally and post about it on your Facebook page. In 2013, separatist calls online and in the media were also criminalized, providing for up to 5 years of imprisonment. So what does it mean? For example, in Abakan, which is also one of the Russian cities, it's a capital of the Russian Republic of Khakassia, a woman called Lydia Bainova is facing up to 5 years of jail under this article of the Criminal Code for a post she made on her social media webpage. She's the granddaughter of one of the Khakas poets. She publishes books herself. She's propagating Khakas culture, which is an ethnic minority in Russia. And her post dealt with discrimination, she says she and her family are dealing with in the region. For example, she went to a cafe with her daughter and she was denied to enter in entrance, and the owners told her that only ethnically Russians were allowed to enter, and so on. And she had rental and job applications were also denied because of her non-Slavic appearance. So she listed all these examples in the post, and she wrote, quote, "At such moments, one wants to make a revolution and a coup. Give power and land to our people back. We will win our land back." But the post didn't include any specific action plans to make this coup d'état, I don't know, or no calls of violence. She subsequently deleted the post, but several months ago, investigators launched a case against her, confiscated her computer and other equipment, and she is now also under trial. 2014, Russia's parliament adopted the so-called Bloggers Law as a part of a broader counterterrorism legislative package. The law required Russian bloggers with more than 3,000 unique visitors per day to assume practically the same legal obligations as mass media outlets. Bloggers now took responsibility for verifying the accuracy of information. They could also be held liable for comments posted by third parties on their websites or social media page, and had to provide their real name, their initials, their contact details. But luckily, the law was cancelled a year ago, thanks God. The same year, 2014, a new article of the Criminal Code prohibits the rehabilitation of Nazism and provides for up to 5 years imprisonment. It criminalizes, quote, "the dissemination of false information about activities of the Soviet Union during the Second World War and desecration of symbols of military glory." So experts have criticized the law as very vague and broadly shaped, with the potential of negative impact on journalists, historians, museum curators, any people who are investigating the Soviet past and its role in World War II. It's strange that this article, the Russian rehabilitation of Nazism article, is actually usually applied to oppositional activists, in many cases to supporters of Alexei Navalny, who's one of the prominent Putin's critics, For example, after Navalny had been attacked with, it's called an antiseptic, a brilliant green antiseptic. So someone attacked him and splashed his face with this antiseptic dye, and it resulted in a chemical eye burn. And after that, a coordinator of his Volgograd office published a photo of the Mother Cole's World War II memorial splashed with photoshopped green color. He didn't really damage the monument, the real monument. He just posted a picture with photoshopped green drops, green paint. And it was enough for filing a case and placing this man, Alexei Volkov, under house arrest for some time. Two sets of amendments to the mass media law adopted in 2014 and 2015 reduced the percentage for permissible foreign participation in the registered capital of any print media, online media, television, or radio broadcaster from 50% to 20%. So all media outlets, broadcasters, publishers must also report all of their funding originating from broadly defined international sources. A year ago, federal law amending the Lugovoy Law further allowed the Russian authorities to label media outlets that are both registered abroad and foreign funded as foreign agents with restrictive reporting requirements. By the way, physical persons, people also can be named foreign agents. So if you got, I don't know, 100 bill from abroad, you must indicate everywhere that you are a foreign agent. The year 2015, a new federal law has been introduced in Russia. It requires the personal data of Russian citizens to be stored on database servers located within Russia. The year 2016, a new federal law further restricts access to online content. It requires owners of news aggregators, including search engines, with more than 1 million daily users to be accountable for the truthfulness of publicly important information before its dissemination. So if the authorities dispute the veracity of information of so-called public importance, they would ban it, and the aggregator has to be, the news report has to be removed within 24 hours. News aggregators must store all information pertaining to news, including the source and duration of dissemination, for 6 months, and they must enable the government agency to access the stored data. In addition, search engines that potentially advertise products and services for Russian audiences in Russian and in the state languages of the various republics of Russia may only be owned by national companies or citizens. Non-compliance entails large fines. So there is already some evidence that these news aggregators are hiding many websites. They're not showing them, including civil society websites, of course. Same year, there appeared two federal laws known as the Yarovaya package, named after the parliamentarian who introduced them. The Yarovaya package compels communications providers and internet operators to store information about users' communications activities from July 2016 and to store all content of communications from July 2018. Information must be stored for at least 6 months and made accessible to the security services without a court order. Operators are required to disclose means to decrypt encrypted data at security services' request and only use encryption methods approved by the government, effectively imposing mandatory cryptographic backdoors with penalties of up to 1 million rubles. It's approximately $16,000 in case of non-compliance. So now many Russian citizens are fighting their way to avoid these restrictions, using VPN servers, for example. Also, our government restricted the rights of citizens to access information during election campaigns. Among other limitations, only accredited reporters can now be present on the premises of the election stations. Just to give you some taste of what's happening in Russia and how these laws are really implemented in practice, I would like just to listen some events that have happened there in the country during last 3 or 4 weeks while I'm in Iowa. There's some cases. A guy from Novokuznetsk, which is one of the Russian towns, it's a town in the Urals, Oleg Astafyev, he posted an animated musical clip of the punk band called Red Mildew. And according to the plot of this musical clip, participants of the band, they enter into combat with Nazis. Nazis represent pop music in this comical musical clip. They are personifying pop music. Though there are no signs of justifying Nazism in this clip, Oleg Astafyev has been arrested, and he's also under trial now. His computer has been withdrawn, and the criminal case has been filed. In St. Petersburg, also it's a very absurd case. A man named Eduard Nikitsin, who is now under criminal investigation for posting a caricature and a joke on his social media webpage. He's about to be sent to a psychiatric ward for a compulsory treatment. I will tell you this fatal anecdote. I hope no one will end up in a jail after this. So the son approaches his father and asks, "Daddy, do you think anything will change in our country after the election?" And father answers, "No, I don't think that anything will change." "But why?" asks the son. "You know, my son," answers the father, "if you put a few cherries on a bunch of shit, a shit doesn't turn into a cake." So that joke is a sufficient reason for indictment nowadays in Russia. So there have been almost 800 cases on online extremism filed just this year, during 2018 at this point. And most of them are similar to this case, to Nikitin's case. People are just charged for posting and reposting funny pictures, or their posts are merely pretexts to arrest people for their civic activities. Another case, in a town called Sызrань, a local theater is preparing to open its 100th season with Nicholas Gogol's play. The Governmental Inspector is a famous Russian play. And the posters of the coming performance the posters disseminated around the town, they said, "A nightmare of a governmental official in 2 parts." And one of the governmental officials of Sızrань was so much infuriated with these posters that they were removed, of course. The sentence was deleted, and there are rumors that a director and a producer of the performance are about to leave their jobs in January because of this case. In Ekaterinburg recently, only in September, in the beginning of September, a 17-year-old girl was denied to be sold collections of poetry by Sergei Senin, Vladimir Mayakovsky, and Joseph Brodsky. She tried to buy these books in 3 different bookstores in the town, but the booksellers didn't yield and denied to sell the books to her. They asked her to show her ID and stated that according to the law, this kind of literature is plus 18 and thus prohibited to children. So the law that they were referring to is a federal law introduced like 8 years ago, and it is called On Protection of Children from Harmful Information, to the information harmful to their health and development. And one of the amendments passed in 2013 added propaganda promoting non-traditional sexual relationships as a class of harmful content under the law. In the same town, in Ekaterinburg, There was a big wave of cyberbullying against gays recently. They were threatened to be killed and beaten up. And one woman referred to a central so-called Center E. Center E is a very shady organization which appeared a few years ago in Russia. It's called E because of the word extremism. So the first letter in the word. And they're supposed to track extremistic activity around the country. But the only thing they do is harassing and badgering school children after their participation on street rallies. They summon them from their lessons, they interrogate them, they bully them, and they also, I know some people who've been threatened by those shady men, very unshoveled, without any uniform, but you can easily recognize them by their faces and the look in their eyes. And they are those who usually loiter around pickets or rallies or some mass street meetings, and then they promptly report to the police by cell phone, and they try to provoke the participants of public events to make them, they're trying to involve them into fights, or they are threatening to plant drugs and or some other things. So planting drugs is very popular. So the woman, one of the women who was very concerned about this cyberbullying and the fact that gays were denied to enter one of the shops in the town, she referred to this Center A organization, but they answered that gays and sexual minorities do not belong to any social group which is to be protected from bullying and hatred, though it's their direct job to protect people from hatred. And also, just yesterday in Dagestan, which is also, I already mentioned that it's my native republic. I grew up there. An artist called Katrin Ninasheva, a local journalist and a photographer, they were detained after a performance against tortures in police stations, psychiatric wards, and in prisons in Russia. So the performance was called Cargo 300. Cargo 300 is a military code word for injured soldiers transported from the battlefield. And so the artist put herself into a metal cage tightly wrapped with cellophane and adorned with the inscription, "This body has been tortured." And this was the foundation for her detention. And one of the very funny cases, and tragic at the same time, is an event that happened like 3 weeks ago in Kaliningrad, which is in the west of Russia. An annual Kafka and Orwell forum was going on there. It started in 2012 when the Russian reality started emulating and was beginning to look like Kafka's and Orwell's world in action. So this forum is a place where public intellectuals, writers, and commentators and experts, they gather together and they discuss what's going on in the country. And the driving force of this forum is the organization called Transparency International, which is officially labeled as a foreign agent, of course. And this year, the forum was organized together with the Committee of Civic Initiatives. And after the formal part of the forum ended, police barged into one of the rooms. So they destroyed a door, and 3 participants were detained during this show raid. There were cameramen and media journalists and this masked special security policeman. They detained 3 participants of this forum, and the headlines in the articles that were published immediately after the detention underlined the connection between the forum's organizers and drug dealers, of course. And the TV reports on the low morals of the forum's participants, they appeared throughout the country through the national media. Still, the detainees were released the following day and returned to Moscow, and none of them were charged with drug offenses, just with administrative offenses. And here is what one of the detainees, a Moscow political consultant, Artyom Ponyushkin, said about the operation. From the start, the masked police were talking about the forum, Transparency International, some sort of revolutionaries, and so on. A camera team from Moscow was also present with the police. This raid was prepared in advance. It wasn't part of a real investigation. It was just a show for the cameras. According to Russian law, and I think elsewhere, you need to have a warrant from the police to break into a residence. There should be a real suspicion and some kind of initial evidence approved by a judge. It was clear that this was all being done for the show of it. We were handcuffed and placed on the floor. They thrashed us with truncheons. One of us was hit over the head with a pistol, and then everything ended in an administrative offense, as if we had crossed the road in the wrong place. So, by the way, some of the cameramen that badgered the participants of the program, of the forum, were working for so-called Evgeny Prigozhin's troll factory. Maybe you heard about this guy. He's among, he's in the US's blacklist because the media companies belonging to him were involved into the meddling in their 2016 US election campaign. And so this troll factory is a very absurd organization. It's a building in St. Petersburg where around 1,000 young people sit for 12 hours every day, and they create posts the company has employed fake accounts registered on major social works, on YouTube, on discussion boards, on Zines, and so these fake bloggers are promoting the Kremlin's interests in domestic and foreign policy. They're posting comments. They have to post, I think, 126 a day, and each of them has 3 blogs on different accounts. And they have to post, I think, 100 comment. And some former trolls, by the way, they acknowledged that they started working for this company for the sake of writing, because they enjoyed writing and getting so much money just almost for nothing. But then they added that the creativity that was present in the beginning, that it diminished soon, and they were all like zombies in the end. So I can proceed in this vein, but maybe you have some questions, and forgive me for my faltering English, please, and I would be happy to answer your questions.
So the first question for you, Alisa, is, do you fear being arrested and charged with some crime upon returning to Russia? And are you considered a foreign agent?
Okay, the reality and my experience tells me that you can be arrested whatever you do, and wherever you go, and so it doesn't actually depend on your real statements and your real activity, because there is always something that you can be blackmailed with or threatened for. So the only path I see is just to express my actual opinion. As for the foreign agent, I think I am. I have to acknowledge this, but maybe I'm an agent of non-partisanship and of cosmopolitan values. So it must be considered non-patriotic, I think, in Russia.
we might also say an agent of literature. How do regular people view these acts and gross misuses of laws and investigations? Is there a majority who accept the changes as legitimate? Do Russian people discuss censorship and political criminals, or are they too scared to do so?
Unfortunately, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's very hard to persuade Russian public, the general public, that these people who were arrested and sentenced for their views and for their worldviews and for their words were not real criminals, because they believe what they see on state television. They believe what their officials say. And of course, they're terrified when they see such horrendous words like terrorism or pedophilia, and I think everyone would be. And maybe they are too lazy sometimes to take their time and to delve into question and to find out more.
I was thinking often of Milan Kundera's novel, The Joke, in realizing that once again it seems completely current. You suggested that some of these cases might result from the whims of an official, but the laws you list have been passed by the legislature, so they reflect the regime's interests. Why are they so afraid of humor and criticism?
If you look at these guys sitting in a so-called parliament, one of our officials famously said, "Parliament is not a place for discussion." So it's really not a place for discussion in Russia, and they're quite illiterate people. Many of them, they are people belonging to power groups, not to intellectuals, and maybe it would be a big sacrilege to say that even our president is not a big book reader. Maybe there is something in common between our presidents. So he is not interested in literature or in arts. All the people who are keeping power in Russia, they are all former bodies. It's a very narrow circle of people who attended the same sports club in St. Petersburg, including President Putin. They all are former guards, former security officers, secret security officers, former sports trainers. And so I think humor requires some wit and some cleverness and some highbrowness, which they lack.
When you became a writer, did you have any idea of the risks that artists might face? And how was your awareness raised? And do you fear for your own freedom at home?
So I already mentioned that I'm from the region which is called Dagestan, which maybe stays in avant-garde of everything that is going on in Russia. So it's been quite dangerous to speak about some issues in this region, even before it became dangerous in the Greater Russia, or in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, especially because of their situation, because it is a hotspot and a place where fights between different branches of Islam happen. It's a place where conservatism and fundamentalist values are trying to take sway, and also misogyny is also flourishing during last 10 or 15 years especially. So when I started writing, there was a reason of me taking a male pseudonym, and I really experienced some criticism, some anger, some hatred, some bullying from this side of society, so I was quite prepared for this. But I think many of the writers who are not used to this attitude from the public, and especially from the governmental authorities, they're quite. They feel themselves threatened, and they prefer to keep silence and not to raise their voice on some heavier and important issues of current interest. Many of writers I know they're good writers, but they prefer to keep silence and to remain hermits, like artistic creatures belonging to a lofty world of literature and not to this greasy world of politics. Maybe this is one of the ways to avoid being arrested or sentenced, but I think if someone whimsically decides to arrest a writer, he doesn't have any real foundations for it, as I've mentioned already.
A question about what would you like us to do, and one thing I can say is that Alisa's novels Bride and Groom and The Mountain and the Wall are available at Prairie Lights. There you'll get a taste of who this writer really is. And in connection with your comment about the recent plot development of your novel, Offended Sensibilities, to see it actually playing out in real life in Russia today, how do you compete as a writer with this kind of nuttiness, which is, of course, the problem that Americans writers face in this current political state? So that's a many-armed question.
Mm-hmm. It's indeed very complex, and it's a complicated challenge to deal with these current issues in a piece of fiction, in a novel which is supposed to be purely artistic. And one of the ways that I chose was trying to write absurdly and hyperbolically satirical novel with all this reporting and anonymous snitching going on, and with a pseudo-detective bent to its plot. But many of the critical feedback and reviews that have already appeared in Russian media, they really do not know what to do with this, and they're trying to pigeonhole me into something. They are recalling Gogol's name, the famous satirical writer, and most of them are quite skeptical. And most of the critics are not sure that reality and contemporariness of Russia is something that a writer has and needs to deal with. So many of my peers, they prefer to write historical novels nowadays, and almost nobody writes about today's Russia, which is a pity. Maybe one of the reasons for that is the fact that it's very hard to compete with reality. It's more absurd than anything you can imagine.
Yeah. Well, we admire your courage. I'm going to end with one last question. One of the traditional scapegoats used by both Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union, Soviet regimes, has been the Jews. Can you tell us something about the situation there? And the second part of that question is, given what you have been describing, are you personally at risk? I think you've answered that in some ways, but I want you to know if all goes to hell, we'll keep you here in Iowa City, if necessary.
I first encountered anti-Semitism when I came to Moscow. I was 17 years old, and I came from the region populated by so many ethnic minorities. And though there is this rise of fundamental Islam and conservatism, still people are used to having Jews at side, and some of them used to be Christians just 150 years ago. And so there was this big amount of tolerance in my region. But when I came to Moscow, I found out that the former Soviet Union of writers split into two, and into so-called patriotic one or communist one and liberal one. And the liberal one is called Jewish. And my professor turned out to belong to the communist one, and he was very openly anti-Semitic during his seminars and lectures. And when I published one of my first reviews in the Novy Mir, which used to be a famous literary journal in Soviet Union and still is popular in Russia, He charged some penalties, and he was very angry with it. And he was about to expel me from his class because I was published in a Jews magazine, as he told me. And I also ran into some conclusions made by some of my readers and some of their actors and participants of the literary process in Russia. I have this quite unusual name for Muslim-populated region. I was named after Lewis Carroll's character, Alice, but it was translated like Alice in Wonderland. And my patronymic, which is my father's name, is also unusual. It's usually belongs to Jewish community in Russia, though he's not a Jew, but his name was Arkady, and he was named after a Soviet writer called Arkady Gaidar. The guests were very drunk. They were celebrating his birth, and one of them took a book from the bookshelf, and they decided to name him Arkady. So I'm Alisa Arkadyevna, which is very un-Dagestanian and very Jewishly sounding name. So many of people who were trying to tell something bad about me, something derogatory, they implied that I in reality was a Jew, which was funny.
We conclude our program now, and thank you, Alisa, for your presentation. I'd like to also thank our sponsors, the University of Iowa's International Programs, UI Honors Program, the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization. We thank today's special sponsors, Mike Margolin, University of Iowa Community Credit Union, and Jim and Pat F. Grave. And we thank City Channel 4 for making our programs available to viewing audiences. And Alisa, as a small token of our appreciation, we'd like to present you with our coveted Iowa City Foreign Relations Council mug.
Wow.
We are adjourned.